And welcome into the Hustle Show podcast here for a Hustle Short on this Friday before week 2 of the college football season. I'm Mark Zinno, joined by my partner in crime, the affable, the lovely, the wonderful, the friendly Brian Power joins us here at Brian Power _wins on Twitter. I'm at Mark Zinno, MarkZinobp. Good to be with you here on this Friday. Excited for week 2 in college football. How are we doing today?
Doing great. You know, it's almost here. I feel there's like a million games I like on the week 2 card, and I'm going to get to break down, I don't know, 6 of that a million. So, excited, buddy. Let's get into it.
Hey, listen, there's discipline in numbers here. All right, so we're going to go over some big headliner games. We're also going to do 2 games that no one is talking about, but probably should. Let's start with the headliner games here, BP, as a lot of big games on the card, but we'll go first with Nebraska and Colorado. You know, this is a line, just as we started recording, is starting to move again. We're now seeing 2.5s pop up out there as Colorado just a 2.5-point favorite. Looks like several shops down to 2.5, with a couple still hanging around at -3. Is that a telltale for you about how this game goes and what direction it's going to go in? I know a lot of people are trying to find the overreactions in week 1, and how much of it is how much of an overreaction is Colorado at this point?
Well, it's interesting. So I did a preview of this game elsewhere on Wager Talk TV. People could check that out if they're so inclined. I knew there would be a lot of interest, and wow, there was a lot of comments. And it's really interesting because with Colorado, you talk about, where they were last year and stuff. Does any of that really matter? It's basically like almost an expansion team, right? It's totally transformed. You can basically throw out everything from last year. We know this. Kelly tweeted this, or sent us this tweet, I should say, just like an hour ago. There is more money bet on Colorado this week than any NFL team. So they are, the public loves them. The public loved them last week. We all know the look-ahead line for this game was Nebraska -8.5. So there was a major correction right off the bat, and maybe for good reason. Last week, Big Ten teams, there were 11 of them favored. Only 3 won and covered. So Nebraska covers as a dog. They should have won that game outright at Minnesota. I think we would agree on that. Turnovers and poor late game execution, which has been the story in Lincoln now for 3 years, killed the Cornhuskers. And it's just a question of how wrong were we preseason about Colorado, I think, Mark, is the way we have to approach this game.
Mm-hmm. How wrong were we about TCU? Because let's look at the opponent that they played, because I think you have to measure that in this whole thing here. I mean, look, TCU had a ton of turnover on their roster, right? They lost their quarterback. They lost a lot of their key players, their running back, whatever it may be. And look, this is a different team in TCU. Still, we keep forgetting that Colorado gave up 42 points last week. Now, I'm not sitting here telling you that Matt Rule and Nebraska's offense are anything to write home about, but Colorado's defense is still a liability here. Yes. And I would argue that Nebraska's defense might be slightly better than TCU's is at this point. Is that enough to make up the delta between what we saw last week and this week?
Oh, I don't think there's any argument that Nebraska's defense is better than TCU's. You go back to last year's Big 12 championship game, TCU has given up like 200 points and 2,000 yards in its last 4 games. Yeah. Not good, needless to say. So Nebraska doesn't want to get into a shootout here, but I agree with you. Colorado's defense is a liability, and it's all about, can Nebraska's defense slow down what we saw Colorado's offense do last week, because TCU had all sorts of problem with Sean Lewis's tempo in that game.
All right, let's move on here to Utah and Baylor. The Baylor Bears, a team that stunk it up in week 1 and a home loss, unexpectedly, to say the least, as a heavy favorite. And, of course, Utah took on Florida, hosted Florida out in Utah, and they pretty much dismantled them physically up and down the field. And, Utah had several months to prepare. They had a backup quarterback there. Cam Rising, they're talking about him possibly playing this week. I personally don't think he's going to play. I think it's just noise and scuttlebutt, and what football coaches like to do. Everything is information that they have to prepare for and waste more time. I don't think Cam Rising is playing. There's no reason for him to play in this spot, because everything that Utah has in front of them here is still in front of them, i.e. the Pac-12 championship, and that's really what they need to focus on. So they can go into Waco here with a little bit of, cachet after week 1, but it feels like a spot, and this line has moved up to Baylor plus 7.5 here. So you're over a touchdown. You're over that key number of 7. But it just feels like a spot here where Baylor has to bounce back, right? Back-to-back home games, a stinking home loss. Situationally, the spot screams for Baylor.
Yes. I mean, this is the classic, like what you referred to with Colorado and Nebraska earlier, the week 2 overreaction game. Oh my goodness, Baylor. That was the worst loss by any favorite on the board last week. Obviously Colorado, rightly so, got all the attention, but there was no bigger favorite that lost outright than Baylor. It's interesting the market moves against Utah last week. This week it moves towards them. You talk about how they're up over a touchdown. Baylor still put up 524 yards of offense despite losing Chapin. That's good. The not good is the fact they gave up 42 points and 441 yards to Texas State. So that's a concern. It's obviously a game where we know Baylor's quarterback's not going to play. Utah's starting quarterback may not play. Baylor is 11-3 against the number. Its last 14 non-conference home games. They're 4-0 straight up and against the number. Last 4 against teams from the Pac-12. But going back to last year, Baylor has lost 5 straight games. Now, is there a problem in Waco? Yeah. Do they need to bring our good friend Chris Thurston in for a pregame pep talk? I don't know. We know that Utah's had 2 extra days to prepare, but they really benefited from Florida going 1 for 13 and third down in that game. That easy talk. And Graham Mertz, I don't need to tell you, stinks.
Yeah, well, yes, I tried to tell Kelly that, but that's neither here nor there. Anyway, I would say this much though, and there is a point to that. The Utah backup, Braden, what's his name? I stumbled. I know it's with a B, but anyway, my point simply is he had like weeks and weeks and weeks to prepare for Florida. This is a much shorter turnaround for a Baylor team with a lot less film study and everything else. Look, I trust Dave Aranda as a head coach. These are the spots here where I think that he sort of excels. Particularly as a home underdog. Baylor as a favorite's one thing. We talk about this all the time, you and I, BP. As a favorite, it's one thing. As a dog, it's a completely different conversation. So I think that Baylor situationally screams the right side. I want to see what Utah is able to do offensively here against on the road against a different opponent and see how they can react. I'm not 100% sure that a backup here is what happens. If the Cam Rising is in this game somehow, I think it changes it, but I just genuinely don't think he's going to play. All right, next game here, Notre Dame and NC State. Speaking of overreactions, Notre Dame dismantled Navy in week 1, and they look like a great team. And, all of a sudden Sam Hartman is going to win the Heisman, and, Notre Dame looks unbeatable, and they're back in the college football playoff picture. And NC State's sort of forgotten about. They lose their quarterback in the transfer portal and Devin Leary last year, and this is still a team that's built on defense. And Raleigh is not exactly the easiest place to play. We've seen NC State upset teams at home. I don't know if they can pull off the upset here, but again, another spot that feels like a home dog is going to bark.
Well, the interesting part of this handicap, Mark, is that NC State knows Sam Hartman quite well. Sam Hartman, who, by the way, looks like every bartender in America, I feel like. He took off his helmet last week I was like, my God, I think this guy served me an old-fashioned last week. But anyway, NC State knows him well. They faced him 3 times, obviously, because Hartman came from Wake Forest. Hartman was only 1-2 in those 3 games straight up. The win was just by 3 points. And he had as many interceptions as he did touchdowns in those 3 games, 6. So you talk about NC State being known for defense. Quietly, in what was viewed as a disappointing 2022 for them, they were 11th in Notre Dame. They start 0-3 against the number under Marcus Freeman. All of a sudden, they've covered 9 of 12. Are we getting back into territory, Mark, where the Fighting Irish, obviously always a public team, maybe a little bit overvalued?
Yeah, and again, I think a lot of this game, too, will boil down to how well NC State's offense can actually score on Notre Dame. Now, look, they only gave up, 3.7, whatever it was to Navy. It was a single digit. And, this is a Notre Dame defense that's yet to be tested. So let's see what they look like up against a legitimate offense that's not a triple option, one that can throw the ball. Let's see where they fit in that whole deal. Because ultimately, I think if NC State can get to 20-23 in this game, they're going to be in line for a good cover. Notre Dame is not an offense, even with Sam Hartman, they're not an offense that's going to churn out 40 points a game.
No. The one thing I didn't like about NC State last week is Brennan Armstrong running it 19 times. He didn't have a single completion over 20 yards. That's not great, obviously.
All right, our final game of the headliners we're going to look at here, Texas Tech hosting the Oregon Ducks. Texas Tech, another team that's catching points at home. A rather disappointing week 1 for the Red Raiders. Did not really look as efficient as you wanted them to. Oregon looks like they are the best offense in the country right now, with all deference to USC and some of the other programs out there. Van Wilder's still quarterbacking for Oregon. I'm sorry. Bo Nix still quarterbacking for Oregon. But nonetheless, another situational spot here. I'll say this at the top, and I get all the reasons to pick Texas Tech. I understand all the reasons why situationally it screams Texas Tech. And I certainly understand that Oregon beating Portland State doesn't do anything for anybody. However, I am not going to get in front of Oregon's offense right now. I'm just not going to do it. I have no desire to step in front of this particular offense. I would get in front of USC before I'd get in front of Oregon, just simply because Oregon's defense actually can make stops and USC's at this point can't. So this is an offense that can run the ball. They can throw it. Bo Nix is going to be a Heisman candidate. Should have been one last year, in my opinion. But again, just stay away from me because I'm not stepping in front of Oregon's offense.
Look, the people who like Texas Tech, it's for a couple reasons. One, this team was at a home dog twice last year against Texas and Oklahoma. What did they do in those games? They won both of them outright. I like Joey McGuire, the head coach, aggressive. He's going to go for it on fourth down. It's going to be, as an underdog, I like that mentality. But you're right. Oregon's offense was really impressive. Texas Tech, it needs to be said, they were up 17-0 in Laramie. They finished with, they were up plus 111 in total yardage. It's a game they should have won. Bill Conley had the post-game win expectancy up at 83% for the Red Raiders. So, yeah, I mean, Texas Tech should have won last week. The situation screams take the points, which has kind of been the theme so far in the show, right? But, yeah, you do have to be leery about that Oregon offense.
Again, and it's Dan Lanning too is the other key component of this, right? A guy who came from Georgia, knows how to build a program and do it in the likeness of what Kirby Smart has built at Georgia here. He's always going to have a good defense. Like I said, it's just stay away from me. I just am not comfortable right now stepping in front of Oregon until I see a defense out there or until I see them, because I backed them all out last year. Look, and I know at the end of the year they dumped some games and lost some games. A lot of that Bo Nix was injured. You could blame some coaching in that game against Washington, to say the least. But regardless, I'll reiterate, just not a team I want to get in front of right now. All right, let's get to two games here that no one is talking about, but probably should be. BP lead it off here in a wonderful game in the Midwest.
Eastern Michigan at Minnesota is where we're going to turn to here. Not a lot of people talking about it, but yes, Mark, they probably should. Do you remember how many points Minnesota scored last week?
Carry the two. Yeah, no, yes, I don't.
The answer was 13. Do you know how many they're laying this week? 20 and a half. Now, Eastern Michigan's defense is not Nebraska. We know that. They were actually outgained by FCS Howard last week, which isn't something you want on your resume. But here's something you do want on your resume if you're Eastern Michigan. Last 8 seasons, this team is 24-6 against the number as a road underdog. That's really good. And you talk about Minnesota only scoring 13 last week. They only had 3 late in the fourth quarter before a great grab late in the end zone, and then Nebraska, as we talked about earlier in the show, gave away the ball, sets up the game-winning field goal for Minnesota. There was nothing to like really about this Minnesota offense last week. I cannot stress that enough. They had 55 yards and 25 carries on the ground. The Greek gunslinger did not look very good with 20 incompletions. And Nebraska turns it over not once, not twice, not 3 times, but 4 times. And when you talk about that total yardage with Eastern Michigan against Howard last week, a little misleading, Mark, because Eastern Michigan didn't get a chance to rack up a lot of total yardage because why? They returned 2 kickoffs for touchdowns. They have the edge in this game in the old third phase special teams. It's not a great spot situationally for Minnesota. They're off the Big Ten opener, a close win, and they've got North Carolina on deck. I would grab the points with Eastern Michigan, the team from Ypsilanti here.
All right. Ypsilanti, huh? All right. That's a new city in America I did not know existed just prior to 30. Oh, there you go. There you go. It's not even an I. It's a Y. It's phonetic. There we go. All right. I'm going to go to a Power 5 matchup here out west in a game that probably nobody's going to watch because it kicks off at 10:30 Eastern. But Oklahoma State is in Tempe to face Arizona State in a matchup between two teams that struggled in week 1, but both escaped with victories. Cowboys were 26.5-point favorites over Central Arkansas. They only win by 14. Sun Devils squeak out a 3-point win over Southern Utah as 34.5-point favorites. Now, this is some of the overreaction that I talked about in week 1. Oklahoma State I know they're a program that's sort of in transition right now. They've lost a bunch of players from last year. They're not going to be as good this year as they were last year. But still, they managed to put up almost 500 yards of offense last week, even though the fact that they did not score a ton of points. What is a little bit shaky is that Mike Gundy is using 3 quarterbacks right now to start. Garrett Rangel, Alex Bowman, and Gunnar Gundy. They all played throughout the game last week. Combined, did not have a bad game. 30 of 48 for 304 yards passing and a touchdown. So these are all competent guys. I think they're still trying to figure out more of who's going to play what. But the bottom line here is this for Oklahoma State and their offense. They've got a veteran offensive line that's very good. And Mike Gundy is going to have a huge coaching advantage here. They have an advantage in the receiving core with Brendan Presley. Oklahoma State does. They're just flat out more talented than Arizona State is at this point in time. I think the Cowboys could take advantage as the Sun Devils didn't record a single sack last week in their game. And offensively, they should be able to score. Sun Devils without their main starter, Drew Pine, who transferred from Notre Dame. He's got the hamstring injury. So true freshman Jaden Rashada is the starter now. Had a good game, but they still only managed 370 yards of offense against Southern Utah. I think that Cameron Scatabo, the transfer from Sacramento State, the running back, is going to be, efficient in the game, but it's nothing that the Cowboys can't handle. Mike Gundy also comes into this matchup here with non-conference spots, going 8-1 straight up, 7-2 against the number against Pac-12 opponents, including 5-1 against the number on the road. For his career, Gundy is also 40-21 ATS against non-conference opponents here. I think Oklahoma State likely got the wake-up call it needed in their game against Central Arkansas to snap out of this thing, put themselves back in position. We get a very short and favorable number here right at 3. It's not even I'm sitting at 3.5. So if it comes down to a field goal, which I don't think it will, if it comes down to a field goal, you still sort of have a push in your back pocket if you need it here. But I like Oklahoma State against an Arizona State team that is still in full rebuild mode. Right? It is a team that right now I don't think is going to be very good. Kenny Dillingham's trying to rebuild the offense and the defense overall. I like the Cowboys here. I'll lay the 3 points on the road in Tempe against the bad Arizona State team. All right, Brian Power, that'll do it for us here on the Hustle Shorts here on this Friday. Again, follow him on Twitter, X, whatever you want to call it, at Brian Power_wins. I'm at Mark Zinno, MarkZinno. As always, tune into the Hustle Show, the full show, every Thursday night at 7 p.m. And make sure you stay tuned to the Wager Talk YouTube channel for all the great content we have here on the Hustle Show pod and the rest of Wager Talk. For Brian Power, I'm Mark Zinno. You guys have a wonderful Friday. Enjoy Saturday college football. We'll talk to you tomorrow.